I never really liked the idea of camping alone, at least not at night. There's something about the wilderness, the way it feels like everything is watching you, that gets to me. But this time I was determined. My buddies and I had gone camping together for years, but this year was different. I needed a break, some time to think things through without anyone around. So I took a solo trip to a remote part of the Rocky Mountains, away from the crowds. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. I arrived at the site late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the mountain peaks. The campsite was in a small valley, surrounded by dense trees and a steep cliff on one side. Felt isolated, but in a good way. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and went to gather firewood. The crackle of the fire as I set it up was soothing. I didn't bring much, just a small camping stove, a sleeping bag, and some canned food. My plan was to keep it simple. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire, feeling the cold air creeping in as the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnerving when you're alone. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just silence. But I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I ate some canned beans and crackers, then decided to go for a walk before heading to bed. The moon was nearly full, lighting the trail ahead of me in a soft glow. As I walked, I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt heavy, thick with stillness. I tried to shake it off, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more it grew. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I stopped to take a deep breath, trying to calm myself. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't the wind, there was no wind. The sound came from a spot just beyond the reach of the moonlight, and my heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I should check it out, or if I should just head back to the campsite. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just too tired to be afraid. I crept closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The bushes were dense, and I couldn't see anything beyond them. Then, out of nowhere, a shape darted out of the shadows. It was fast, too fast to be an animal. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shape didn't move like a person. It was quick, erratic, like it was running from something. My heart raced as I backed away slowly. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like it meant me any harm, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I made my way back to the campsite as fast as I could, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it didn't feel like any animal I'd ever seen before. When I got back to the campsite, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I stoked the fire, sat down, and tried to calm myself. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. I felt like I could hear something just outside the circle of light, but whenever I looked, there was nothing there. Just the trees swaying in the wind, but the sound was off. It was too quiet, too still. I checked my gear one more time before getting into my tent. The chill of the night air crept in as I zipped up the tent flap, leaving just enough room for me to stick my head out and see the fire. I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me and tried to get some sleep, but it was hard to relax. I kept hearing sounds from the woods, scratching, scurrying, the occasional snap of a twig. Every noise made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but something inside me wasn't convinced. I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up several times, each time to the sound of something moving outside the tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I remembered there wasn't any wind. I held my breath each time I heard something approach, waiting for whatever it was to pass. But the sounds didn't stop. They circled around my tent, getting closer, then fading away, only to return moments later. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The sun had risen, casting a pale light over the trees. The forest seemed much more peaceful in the daylight, but I didn't feel safe. I quickly packed up my things, determined to leave. As I was about to put out the fire, I heard a voice, a loud shout, as if someone was calling out to me from the woods. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed my gear and ran, not bothering to look behind me. I didn't know if it was a person or something else, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The hike back to the parking lot was uneventful, but my mind kept replaying the strange noises from the night. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and took a deep breath. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until the moment I was safely inside. I drove back down the mountain, the gravel road winding through the trees as I made my way home. The air was warm now, and the sun was high in the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. But when I pulled into my driveway and stepped out of the car, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. In the end, I couldn't explain what had happened. I don't know what I saw or heard that night. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, a combination of fatigue and isolation. But it's been years, and I've never gone camping alone again. I still love the outdoors, but I always go with someone now, just in case. Some things are better left unexplained. I had always been the kind of person who loved nature. The quiet, the peace, the escape from the chaos of city life. A weekend camping trip was all I needed to clear my head, recharge, and enjoy the simple things. So, when my buddy Sam suggested we take a trip to the Northwoods in Wisconsin, I didn't think twice about it. The plan was simple enough. Drive up to the campground near the lakeside, set up a tent, cook some food over the fire, and spend the weekend just enjoying the outdoors. Sam and I had been friends since high school, and he was always up for an adventure. We'd gone camping together a few times before, and it had always been a good time. The kind of trip that left you feeling relaxed and satisfied. We left early on a Friday morning, hoping to avoid the weekend rush. The drive was scenic, winding through thick forests and small towns. It wasn't too far from home, but the further we got from civilization, the more isolated it felt. By the time we reached the campground, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The place was quiet, save for a couple of other campers scattered around. We got our campsite set up near the water, unpacked our gear, and started a fire. As the fire crackled, we talked about everything: work, old memories, plans for the future. But there was something about the place that felt off. It wasn't obvious at first, just a weird vibe I couldn't shake. The air felt heavy, thick with moisture from the recent rain. The woods around us were dense, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. There were no birds, no animals. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. We sat in silence for a while, staring into the fire. Sam was the first to break the silence, laughing about how he hadn't been camping in a while. But the sound of his voice only made the quiet feel louder, like it was more unnatural. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That night, we went to bed early. The temperature had dropped, and we were both tired from the drive. Sam snored almost immediately after we crawled into our sleeping bags, but I lay awake for a while. The tent was small, and the wind outside made the fabric flap, but it wasn't what kept me awake. It was the stillness, the complete lack of movement. Even with the wind blowing, there was no sound from the trees, no rustling of animals. Nothing. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I finally drifted off to sleep, but I didn't sleep well. My dreams were fragmented, disjointed, flashes of shadowy figures lurking around the edges of the firelight. I would wake up every hour, each time more uneasy than the last. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange noise outside the tent. It was faint, almost like a scraping sound, but it wasn't natural. It wasn't wind or animal movement. It sounded like something was dragging across the forest floor. Slow, deliberate, almost as if it was trying to remain hidden. My heart started racing. I lay still, straining my ears to listen, but the sound stopped as soon as I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe a tree branch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The rest of the night passed in fitful sleep, and by morning, I was exhausted. Sam was already up, stoking the fire and making coffee. He didn't seem bothered at all. I, on the other hand, felt like something was wrong. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. We spent the day hiking along the lake, trying to put the strange noises behind us. The hike was beautiful, the forest dense with trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The water was calm, with only the occasional ripple breaking the surface. We didn't see another soul on the trail, which was strange for a popular campground. Normally, you'd expect to pass other hikers, but it was like we had the entire place to ourselves. As we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like we weren't alone. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was following us. Just out of sight, just out of reach. I mentioned it to Sam, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just the isolation messing with my head. That night, we cooked dinner over the fire again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The woods were eerily silent. It was like the forest was holding its breath again, waiting. Even Sam seemed a little on edge, though he didn't admit it. We sat close to the fire, talking in quiet voices, trying to avoid the discomfort of the silence around us. Around midnight, when the fire had died down to embers, we decided to turn in for the night. The night was colder, the wind picking up again. I could feel the chill in the air as I zipped up my sleeping bag and pulled the hood tight over my head. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just another night in the woods. But the noises, the ones I couldn't explain, were back. I heard something moving outside the tent. It was slow, deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too rhythmic. It was like footsteps, slow, heavy, dragging through the dirt. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sam was snoring again, oblivious to everything. I didn't want to wake him, but I had to know what it was. I slowly unzipped the tent just a little, enough to peek outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. But then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't just a shadow, though. It was something taller, darker, and it was moving slowly, dragging its feet like it didn't want to make a sound. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. My instinct told me to stay quiet, not to move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had seen me. I closed the tent flap, my heart racing. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to sleep. I kept thinking of all the things it could be, wild animals, another camper. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. It was something else, something that didn't belong. The next morning, Sam was still clueless about the whole thing. We packed up our gear and left the campground early, without saying much to each other. Neither of us mentioned the shadow, but I could tell something had shifted between us. We both felt it, whatever it was. The whole place had an unsettling vibe that I couldn't shake, and I was relieved to leave. As we drove away, the trees began to thin out, and the weight on my chest finally lifted. The further we got from that place, the lighter I felt. The strange noises, the shadows, they all seemed like a bad dream now. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back to those woods. Some places are best left alone, and some things are better left undisturbed. I'd always been a fan of camping. Ever since I was a kid, the idea of being out in the wild, away from everything, gave me a sense of peace. So, when I was in my late 20s and settled down in Ohio, it seemed like the perfect time to introduce the idea to my partner, Megan, who had never camped before. She was a city girl through and through, but I was convinced she'd enjoy it. I'd promised her we'd stick to the more comfortable parts of camping. No roughing it in the middle of nowhere. The plan was simple. We'd head out to Hocking Hills State Park, a place known for its beautiful trails, caves, and scenic views. Megan wasn't a fan of long hikes, but I assured her there'd be easy paths with just the right amount of nature and peace. We decided on a weekend trip, planning to arrive on a Friday afternoon and leave by Sunday. We left home after work, grabbing dinner at a small diner on the way. It was around 8 p.m. when we arrived at the campsite. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, and the forest around us was growing darker with each passing minute. The air had a slight chill to it, which I'd been expecting, and I couldn't help but feel the excitement of getting out into the woods. The campsite was set up in a small, isolated area of the park, far enough from the main campgrounds to avoid the typical crowd, but still accessible enough that we wouldn't have to trek too far with our gear. I'd booked the spot in advance, and the ranger who checked us in had mentioned that it was a quiet area, perfect for a peaceful weekend. He also mentioned that there had been some reports of wildlife activity in the area recently, but it wasn't anything unusual. Megan and I unloaded the car, setting up our tent and gathering firewood. As we worked, I noticed that the forest around us felt strangely quiet. Normally, there'd be the sounds of birds and animals, even at night. Here, though, it was eerily still. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of day, or maybe I was just too focused on making sure everything was ready for the night ahead. By the time we finished setting up, the sky had fully darkened. Megan and I sat by the fire, sipping on hot chocolate, enjoying the crackling sound of the flames. It wasn't long before we started hearing something. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking nearby. Megan looked at me, her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. I could tell she'd heard it too. "It's probably just a deer," I said, trying to reassure her. "They wander around at night." But the sound didn't seem quite right. It wasn't a rustling sound, like an animal brushing against the undergrowth. These steps were too heavy, too human-like. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the warmth of the fire and the peacefulness of the night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't like the usual calm of a campsite at night. There was a sense of something looming, something just outside the range of my vision, that I couldn't quite place. We went to bed around midnight, the sound of the crackling fire still echoing in my mind. The tent felt secure, and despite the lingering unease, I was exhausted from the drive and the setup. Megan fell asleep quickly, but I stayed awake, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. That was when I heard it again, the footsteps. This time they were closer. I could hear them more clearly. They were heavy, deliberate, and they seemed to be moving around the perimeter of our campsite. I sat up slowly, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't want to wake Megan. I wasn't sure how to explain the anxiety creeping up on me. I reached for my flashlight and shone it out of the tent, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the open ground around our campsite, but there was nothing. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breath. I laid back down, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe an animal was wandering through, or maybe it was another camper, though I hadn't seen any other cars when we arrived. After a few minutes, I began to drift off, but the sound of the footsteps kept me from fully relaxing. They were just outside my subconscious, like a shadow moving through my thoughts. I didn't sleep well that night. I woke up several times, convinced that I heard something outside the tent, but every time I checked, there was nothing there. By morning, I was exhausted, but Megan was in high spirits, excited to see the park's famous caves. I didn't mention the footsteps to her. She was new to camping, and I didn't want to freak her out. We spent the day hiking, exploring the caves, and enjoying the stunning views of the park. Megan was starting to warm up to the idea of camping, and I was grateful for that. But something lingered in the back of my mind, the footsteps from the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. By the time we returned to the campsite, it was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set. I decided to keep the fire going, hoping it would add some comfort to the evening. Megan suggested we go for a short walk before it got too dark, so we left the campsite for a brief hike around the area. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. The woods around us were still, too still, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind us. When we returned to the campsite, I decided to take a different route back, one that looped around the perimeter of the site. It was then that I noticed something strange. The area surrounding our tent had been disturbed. The ground was trampled in places, and the firewood we had stacked earlier was scattered around, as though someone had been rummaging through it. I couldn't explain it. Megan hadn't been anywhere near the firewood, and the footsteps from the night before were starting to make sense in a way that I hadn't wanted to admit. I went to check the rest of the campsite, but everything else appeared to be untouched. It wasn't much, but the feeling of being watched, of being intruded upon, was growing stronger. That night, I didn't hear the footsteps again, but the unease never left. I didn't feel safe in the tent anymore, and I could see it in Megan's eyes that she felt the same way. Her excitement from earlier had faded, replaced with a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. We didn't sleep well again, but we managed to make it through the night. In the morning, we packed up as quickly as we could. I couldn't explain it, but I had this overwhelming sense that we needed to leave. We didn't even bother with breakfast, we just grabbed what we could and drove off. As we passed the entrance to the park, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. It's been years since that trip, and I still don't know who or what was out there. The park rangers never reported any incidents, and I never spoke about it to anyone else. I don't think Megan would want to remember it either, but every time I go camping now, I make sure to pick a spot that's not too isolated, and I never, ever camp alone. Something about that experience, those footsteps, the feeling of being watched, has stuck with me, and I know I'll never forget it. We left the park that day, but whatever it was that had been lurking in the woods stayed with me long after we were gone. It was a late autumn afternoon when I set out for my first solo camping trip. I had camped before, of course, with my family and friends, but this was different. This time, it was just me, alone, in a remote patch of woods in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was so isolated that the nearest town was almost an hour's drive away. The whole idea appealed to me, the solitude, the peace, and the challenge of doing it all on my own. I was 24 at the time, young enough to feel adventurous but old enough to have the skills to survive a weekend in the wilderness. I'd researched the area well before making the decision, studying maps, reading reviews, and learning about the wildlife and terrain. The trail I chose, however, wasn't on the official map. It was a lesser-known path, one that was only mentioned in a few old camping forums online. There was something about it that intrigued me. The thought that no one had walked it in years made me feel like I was uncovering something hidden, something untouched by time. I packed my gear, taking only the essentials: a tent, a small camp stove, food for 3 days, and my trusty backpack. I loaded it all into the back of my car, making sure everything was secured. After a quick stop at a small store to pick up some last-minute supplies, I drove towards the trailhead. The weather was crisp, the trees turning vibrant shades of red and orange, the air filled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. I felt a sense of excitement rise within me, and as I left the paved road and turned onto a gravel path that led deeper into the woods, I could feel the quiet embrace of nature settling in around me. It was a 2-mile hike to the actual campsite, and the trail started out easy. The sun was still up, though it was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. The ground was soft, covered with layers of fallen leaves and pine needles. Birds called to each other overhead, their songs breaking the otherwise perfect silence. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I didn't think much of it. I kept walking, the sound of my boots crunching against the earth the only noise around me. After about an hour, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew denser, their branches arching over the path, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It was as if the forest was slowly swallowing me whole. The air felt cooler now, and a strange feeling crept up my spine. I paused for a moment, pulling out my map to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. The trail seemed to be fading. The leaves and underbrush were so thick now that the path was barely visible in some places. I didn't like the idea of turning back, though. The camp was only a little farther ahead, and I had come this far. So, I pressed on, picking my way through the dense woods, my mind focused on the promise of a quiet, peaceful night in the wilderness. The sun was almost gone by the time I reached the campsite. I could see the outline of the small clearing through the trees, and I breathed a sigh of relief. It was just as I had imagined, isolated, serene, and completely private. The clearing was surrounded by thick trees, with a small stream running nearby. It was the perfect spot. I quickly set up my tent, making sure to stake it down securely. There was no one else around for miles, and the thought of being so alone in such a vast, quiet place filled me with a sense of calm. As the evening settled in, I built a fire in the fire pit and started cooking my dinner. The crackling of the flames and the smell of food made me feel content, at peace. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant rush of the stream. Nightfall brought with it a deeper kind of silence. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects during the day, now felt almost unnaturally still. I sat by the fire for a while longer, eating and relaxing, but the growing darkness began to feel heavy, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were closing in on me. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, the air turning colder by the minute. After finishing my meal, I decided to turn in early. I crawled into my tent, pulling the zipper shut behind me. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside was comforting at first, but as the minutes ticked by, it began to feel unsettling. I rolled over, trying to sleep, but the sounds of the night seemed different, not normal. The wind wasn't the only thing making noise. There were other sounds, soft, almost imperceptible movements in the underbrush outside my tent. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But something about the sound was too deliberate, too consistent. It was as if whatever was out there was circling my camp, testing the perimeter. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a moment, and then came again, closer this time. I could feel my heart rate pick up. It was only then that I realized how isolated I truly was. No one around for miles, no one to hear me if I screamed. I lay there, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination, that it was just a curious animal. But the sounds persisted. They came in uneven intervals, always shifting, always circling. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that I'd made a mistake in choosing such a remote spot, that maybe the animals here were different from what I was used to back home. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, scanning the darkness. The campfire had long since died, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I saw nothing, no movement, no shadow, nothing. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but I didn't zip the tent back up right away. I stayed there, my eyes glued to the forest around me, listening intently. It was then that I noticed something strange. The sounds had stopped. The forest was completely still, almost too still. I felt a sudden rush of cold air wash over me. It wasn't just the coolness of the night. It felt different, unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly zipped the tent shut, my hands trembling. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, too aware of every tiny sound, every shift of the wind, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and grow outside the thin walls of my tent. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all, and my mind felt foggy, heavy. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave the campsite behind. The sounds, the unsettling stillness of the night, it all felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I needed to get out of there. As I walked back down the trail, the woods around me felt different. The air felt heavier, and the trees seemed to loom over me, as if watching my every move. I didn't look back once, not even when I heard something, a rustling, a movement off to my side. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept walking, faster now, the familiar trail leading me back to the gravel road and then the car. When I reached the parking area, I felt a sense of relief flood over me. I was out of the woods, back to civilization. I drove away without looking back, the unsettling feeling still gnawing at me. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, and I didn't need to. I'd been alone in the wilderness, and something had watched me, something that didn't belong. I never went back to that trail again, and I never camped alone again. There are places in the world that are best left undisturbed, and that trail, That was one of them. I had always been the outdoors type. Growing up, my family spent more weekends in the woods than anywhere else. There's something about being out in nature, where the world feels simpler and everything you need is just outside your tent flap. I've camped in a lot of places, from small state parks to larger, more remote spots that required a bit of a hike to get to. But nothing really prepared me for that one trip to Pine Ridge. It was late fall and I had decided to take a solo trip. The kind where you pack up your backpack, drive as far into the woods as you can, and then walk to wherever you feel like setting up camp. It was just going to be me, my tent, and the sound of the wind in the trees. No phone signal, no distractions. Just a chance to clear my head and get away from everything. Pine Ridge was about 4 hours from home, tucked deep into a national forest. The drive there was beautiful but nerve-wracking. The road was winding, narrow, and barely maintained. I kept thinking I was going to drive off into a ditch, especially as the sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting everything in a dim, orange glow. There weren't many other cars, just me and the occasional truck passing through. It felt like I was getting further and further from civilization. The kind of isolation I used to crave, but the kind that made you feel small when you actually experienced it. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was already getting dark. I wasn't too worried about it. I had done this before. I always liked arriving just as the sun went down, the world quieting around me. The trailhead had a small, wooden sign with a faded map of the area. I could barely make out the trail I was supposed to follow, but I'd done enough research that I knew where I was going. I double-checked my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, first aid kit, and a small knife for safety. The temperature was dropping quickly, and I could feel the bite of the cold creeping through my jacket. I started my hike, the dirt path crunching under my boots as I moved further into the woods. The trees here were tall and sparse, their branches bare from the changing season. A sharp, clean smell filled the air, and every few steps, I could hear a twig snap somewhere far off. It wasn't long before the sun completely set, and I was alone in the dark. The flashlight bounced off the ground as I walked, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. I kept moving, my feet following the trail, even as the light grew dimmer. That's when I started to hear it, the sound of movement. It wasn't like an animal, more like something brushing against the trees or walking along the path behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound kept pace with me, as though it was following me, not just nearby, but directly behind me. My heart started to pound. I slowed my pace, thinking I was just imagining things, but the sound kept coming, each step matching mine. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing, just the dark stretch of trees. I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else was hiking nearby, but I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. I wasn't that far from the parking lot, either. It didn't make sense. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickened my steps, hoping to reach my campsite soon. It wasn't far. I could still make it in the next half hour if I pushed myself. But the sound didn't go away. It got louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was still following me. I finally reached a small clearing and decided to stop. It was as good a place as any to set up camp, and I needed a moment to catch my breath. I dropped my pack and looked around. There was something unsettling about the way the trees stood, like they were watching me. The air felt still, heavier than before. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake off the weird feeling that was crawling over me. The sound behind me stopped, but now there was something else. A feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there. I tried to focus on the task at hand, hammering in the stakes, pulling the rainfly over the tent. I made a fire and sat in front of it, trying to relax. I made myself a simple meal, dehydrated chili, and ate it in silence, listening to the crackling of the fire. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to emerge from the trees. But no one did. The only sounds were the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. After finishing my meal, I packed everything away and crawled into the tent. I didn't know why I felt so anxious. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The sounds I had heard on the trail kept replaying in my head, making it hard to settle down. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps, whispers, maybe, but it was always in my head. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I had been on edge from the hike and the isolation. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. It was restless, filled with strange dreams of running through the woods, trying to get away from something I couldn't see. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I woke up several times throughout the night, each time more disoriented and uneasy than the last. But each time I'd hear nothing but the wind and the creaking of the trees. When the morning light finally filtered through the trees, I was exhausted. The sun had barely risen, and everything around me was still soaked in mist. It wasn't quite dawn yet, but I felt the need to get moving. I packed up my tent and gear, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I was being followed. I started back down the trail, but something was wrong. It felt like the forest was different in the daylight. More closed in, the trees too dense, the air too still. I couldn't shake the unease that had followed me the night before. I reached a fork in the trail I didn't remember. I checked my map, but I couldn't make sense of it. The route I was supposed to take should have been straight ahead, but this fork seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. I hesitated. I didn't like the idea of getting lost, but I decided to take the right-hand trail, thinking it might loop back to the main path. But the trail seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. I kept walking, each step taking me further away from where I thought I was. The trees grew thicker and the air colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake, that I wasn't supposed to be here. Then, just as I was about to turn around, I saw something. A figure standing in the distance between the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but it looked like a person. I froze, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, facing me. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, locked in place, watching the figure. It was like time had stopped, like nothing was real. But then the figure turned, vanishing back into the trees, leaving me alone in the silence. That was when I decided I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the main trail. I didn't look back. When I finally got back to my car, the relief I felt was overwhelming. I loaded up my gear as quickly as I could and drove away, not stopping until I reached a small town several hours away. The whole drive, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me. In the end, I learned something. It wasn't just about the peace I thought I'd find in the woods, but about the reality of being out there, alone. There's a difference between being at peace with nature and respecting it. I don't know what it was I saw in the woods that day, but I don't plan on going back to Pine Ridge anytime soon. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. I was 28 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon. I'd always enjoyed hiking and the outdoors, but after a few years of city life and a stressful job, I felt like I needed a break. So, I packed my gear, grabbed some food, and drove out to the outskirts of a state forest I'd heard about, Cedarwood National Forest. I've been camping plenty of times, so I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't a particularly well-known spot, which was part of the appeal. I liked the idea of being in a remote area where I wouldn't see anyone for days. The weather was perfect, sunny and a little warm, but nothing too hot. The forecast had said clear skies, and I had everything I needed to be self-sufficient. My backpack was packed with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, a couple of cans of food, and a few water bottles. I also had a first aid kit and some other survival tools just in case. The trail I picked out was an old logging route that had been repurposed into a hiking trail. I figured it would be quiet. A lot of people went to the more popular spots, so I expected to be alone. When I arrived at the trailhead, There was only one other car in the parking lot. The forest stretched out in front of me, thick and dark, the kind of woods that felt alive with rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I could hear the crunch of my boots as I made my way down the path, my breath steady and calm, enjoying the solitude. The first couple of hours on the trail were easy, nothing too steep. I stopped to take a sip of water and snap a few pictures of the scenery. The quietness of the forest was comforting, but at the same time, there was a slight tension that I couldn't shake. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling. The air was damp, and the shadows were deep under the canopy of trees. But I kept walking, pushing it aside as the typical feeling you get when you're in unfamiliar territory. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing where I'd planned to camp. It was a small meadow surrounded by dense trees, with a small creek running through it, perfect for setting up camp. I found a flat spot and set up my tent. I gathered some firewood and made a small campfire, just enough to cook dinner. I wasn't planning to stay long, just a one-night trip, so I figured a small fire would do. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the meadow. As the fire crackled, I ate a simple meal and watched the stars slowly start to appear in the clear sky. It was peaceful, calming even, and I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. It was just me, the fire, and the forest. But as the night deepened, that same strange feeling returned. It wasn't overwhelming at first, just a slight unease. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving through the trees. Could have been an animal, but the sound seemed too deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination, but it was hard to ignore. The woods were unnervingly quiet now, the only noise coming from the fire and the occasional rustle in the trees. I sat up a little straighter, listening harder. I could hear something, a faint crunch of leaves, followed by a distant snap of a twig, then silence. I looked around the clearing. Nothing. I figured it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I wasn't so sure anymore. Something about the way the noise had stopped so abruptly set me on edge. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but I ignored it. I told myself it was nothing. The forest was full of animals. I was just overthinking things. I stayed by the fire, trying to enjoy the moment, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. As the night dragged on, I felt more and more like I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself to relax, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the firelight, but each time, there was nothing. Finally, I decided it was time to turn in. I doused the fire, making sure it was completely out, and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and the sound of the creek running nearby helped calm my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Hours passed, and I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It felt like the darkness outside was pressing in on me. My mind kept wandering back to the noises I'd heard earlier, but I couldn't figure out what had caused them. I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard something again, this time closer. A crunch of leaves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It came again, followed by a soft rustling, like something brushing up against the undergrowth. I held my breath, listening intently. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was out there, moving around the perimeter of my camp. I grabbed my flashlight, silently opening the tent flap. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing in sight. The meadow was still, too still, as though the whole world had gone quiet. But I didn't feel reassured. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat formed on my skin. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there. The next few minutes felt like hours. I stayed as still as I could, straining my ears for any sign of movement. I held the flashlight tightly, ready to shine it in any direction at a moment's notice. I even picked up a large rock just in case. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the panic rising in my chest. Finally, I decided I couldn't just wait there in the tent. I needed to know what was going on. Slowly, I unzipped the flap and crawled out, careful not to make a sound. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I saw it, a figure, standing just outside the ring of light from the campfire. It was barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out the shape of a person, hunched over slightly, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I wasn't imagining it now. There was someone out there. I immediately backed away toward my tent, my mind racing. I had to get away. I didn't know who or what that person was, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and started running. The ground was uneven and I stumbled a few times, but I didn't care. I wasn't looking back. My only goal was to get to the trail and make it to safety. As I ran through the woods, the sounds of movement followed me, too close for comfort. Whoever or whatever was out there was following me, keeping pace. The fear in my chest grew with every step. I wasn't sure how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I broke through the tree line and hit the main trail. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot, gasping for breath. When I finally got to my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, collecting myself. I didn't know who had been following me or why, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't care if I had to drive all night. I was getting out of that forest. The drive back home felt like a blur. My mind kept replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Who had been watching me? Why had they been there? I'll never know. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there in the forest, waiting. When I finally got home, I made sure to tell the authorities about what had happened. I don't know if they ever found out who the person was, but I never returned to that spot. That night in the Cedarwood National Forest was the last time I ever went camping alone.